Hello, I am Mary Mason, President of the Friends of Old Dover. The Dover Days Committee, along with the Friends of Old Dover, also known as the Historical Society of Dover, are pleased to offer you a virtual celebration of our city's heritage. Dover Days began in 1933 by Mabel Lloyd Ridgely as a day with the storied houses and gardens of Old Dover. Through the years, the Dover Days has grown into a lively festival with parades, maypole dancing, historic reenactions, community speakers, and food and craft vendors organized by the Dover Days Committee. Due to the ongoing restrictions of the COVID pandemic, we will celebrate again this year with a series of online lectures on topics such as pre-colonial history, Victorian architecture, religion, ethnic groups, education, horticulture, and social history of Dover. We are proud of our traditions, and our focus is on preserving Dover's historic and architectural heritage for future generations. We hope you enjoy our online program. The Dover Days Committee and the Friends of Old Dover look forward to spending Dover Days with you in person the way it used to be next year. A special thank you goes to the students of the ARVED, Audio, Radio, Video Engineering Design of Caesar Rodney High School for their assistance with this program.
Hello, my name is Ryan Schwartz. I'm the Interpretive Programs Manager here at First State Heritage Park. Now, on behalf of the historic site, I'd like to welcome you to this lecture on the early history of Dover and its environs. Before we get started, just a couple of quick technical notes. First and foremost, this program is going to be delivered to you as a narrated PowerPoint. We also don't have closed captioning available in this format. However, we have included most of the important information that you need to know on the PowerPoint slides themselves, so that way you can feel free to either listen or read along as we go. And so with that technical business out of the way, without further ado, sit back, relax, and let's begin. Hello, this is Ryan Schwartz once again, and I'd like to thank you for joining me for this program. Dover has existed as a settlement continuously for over 300 years, and we at First State Heritage Park are privileged to tell its stories across time. But today, we will be focusing in specifically on the city's earliest days, in this program entitled Colonial Dover, History of a City and Region from Early Settlement to the Eve of Revolution. On the screen in front of you, you will see a brief timeline of the history that we will be touching on in our program today. It's appropriate here that we pause before proceeding to make a note of this lecture's scope. Historians like to keep things orderly, dividing what is really continuous history into epochs, or easy to classify time periods. For us, that means more precisely, we'll be looking at Dover's establishment period, from Native American civilizations to European colonial arrivals, and then the development of the region up until the American Revolution, where we will pause. The Revolution marks an important shift in our history, wherein the 13 British North American colonies on the Atlantic seaboard declared independence, effectively ending our nation's colonial period. Any further program would have to then proceed through the Revolution and into the early American Republic. The American Revolution, of course, and our part in it, is worthy of its own installment, and so today we will simply be exploring up to the outbreak of war with Britain in this presentation. And so, in summary, you can see here on the slide the 5 points that we will be touching on during the course of this program. These will be easily distinguished by separation slides on the screen that will tell you when we've hit each point, beginning with early settlement, moving on to the establishment of Kent County, then to the founding of Dover itself, finally then into glimpses of the colonial world that you can still see in evidence here in Dover, and ending with further reading, a list of recommendations that I can offer up to you as valuable resources as you conduct your own explorations into Dover's early history. And so, Just to prove that I keep my promises right from the get-go, here we have our first stop in our exploration today. Early settlement. Native American inhabitants meet European colonists. Human beings have inhabited the Delmarva Peninsula for at least 15,000 years. In fact, a site near Hockessin, Delaware, has been radiocarbon dated to the year 9,500 BCE, that is, before the Common Era. And you can see then, since that point in time, historians have utilized that epoch thing that I mentioned before, dividing up human settlement into a variety of different time periods, from the Paleo-Indian period that dated from 12,000 BCE to 6,500, and then all the way up to the contact period of 1600 to 1750 CE, that is, in the Common Era, which will consume most of the program that we're going to be discussing today. And so it's important that we note right from the beginning that a rich and complex society had developed here millennia before the arrival of Europeans, a heritage that is still kept alive today by the modern Lenni Lenape and Nanticoke tribes. Let's begin with some background on the Lenni Lenape tribe, a member of the Algonquian language group. In fact, their name, Lenni Lenape, means the original people, a title which refers to their status as a grandfather civilization to other younger tribes of the East Coast Algonquian family. The Lenni Lenape inhabited much of the Delmarva Peninsula at the time of European settlement in the early 1600s. Their date of first arrival is, of course, unknown, but the tribe claims a 10,000-year lineage in this land. At the time of the first contact period, they were a loose confederation of people who occupied a stretch of land in the mid-Atlantic they called Lenapehoking, which included parts of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and, of course, Delaware. Zooming in a little bit, we can see that the Lenape had developed over time into a sophisticated agricultural society with a strong tradition of matrilineal leadership. This meant, of course, that women made many of the vital decisions for the operations of the tribe on a day-to-day basis, a custom that they carry forward even to the present day. Looking at each individual group of the Lenape, they tended to root themselves to the land in family or small community segments. In broad brushstrokes, we can look at the Lenape as broken into three regional and language groups. We have the Munsee, the people of the Stony Country, who inhabited the north, particularly in the New York region. The Unami, the people downriver of the central region that encompassed much of Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey. And the Unalaktico, the people who lived near the ocean from the south who occupied the Delmarva Peninsula in particular. They're also broken into three primary clans: the Wolf, or the Tukusit, Turtle, the Pukawunku, and Turkey, or Pele. The other tribal group of particular concern to us are the Nanticoke people, otherwise known as the people of the Tidewater. Like their more powerful Lenape neighbors to the northeast, the Nanticoke are also considered an Algonquian civilization. Historically, these people settled on Maryland's eastern shore and into what is today's Sussex County and even some fringes of Lower Kent County. They were known for their extensive trade networks throughout the Chesapeake region. However, by the early 1600s, possibly due to pressures from European colonizers, and certainly because of antagonistic relationships with other Native American tribes across Chesapeake Bay, the Nanticoke began a gradual spread east across the Delmarva Peninsula, a forced migration. Already beginning to intermingle, they would eventually merge completely with the Lenni Lenape in a confederation that still survives today. This process was accelerated in particular due to being named enemies of Maryland colony in 1642. This tragic uprooting of their civilization has resulted in much of their culture becoming fractured, even their language becoming lost completely, with its final native speaker dying in 1856. As with most Native American groups, European first contact had a stark impact on their societies on this peninsula. The Lenape people first encountered Europeans near New York's Long Island in the year 1524. In our region, the first encounter seems to have been between the Nanticoke and expeditions from Virginia's Jamestown colony under John Smith in 1608. Even at these early dates, the Lenni Lenape and Nanticoke populations in our region had been devastated by disease, especially smallpox, for which they had no previous immunities. Modern estimates place the Lenape population at about 20,000 in 1600. By 1682, they were only about 4,000, with the sharpest decline in their population in just the preceding 15 years. As more European settlements emerged, they increasingly changed the dynamic between the diminished tribes through diplomacy, trade, and warfare. The Nanticoke and Lenape in particular saw their power decrease in favor of the Susquehannocks, a people that occupied significant swaths of Maryland, and then to the powerful Iroquois Confederacy that emerged from the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York. Europeans, meanwhile, looked at both the Nanticoke and the Lenape as one single group and began referring to them collectively as the Delawares. Englishman John Smith may have been one of the first Europeans to lay his eyes upon these lands, but he was far from the last. In the first half of the 17th century, three major European powers vied for control over Delmarva. The first to plant their flag here was the Dutch Republic, who established the first colonial settlement and trading outpost near present-day Lewis in 1631. They named their settlement Zwanendel. Unfortunately for them, the colony was not to last and did not survive its first year. It was discovered destroyed by a resupply mission in December of 1632. Up next, we have the Kingdom of Sweden. This is surprising to many individuals who don't realize that Sweden was once a major European power. In fact, in the early 1600s, it was bidding fair to become the dominant military force in Northern Europe under its enlightened monarch and conquering king, Gustavus Adolphus. At this point in time, national greatness was often measured by its control of colonial possessions, and New World colonies in particular were in fashion. So it was that a ship named the Kalmar Nickel with a detachment of soldiers was dispatched to stake Sweden's claim in the New World. Landing near what is now Wilmington, they established Fort Christina in 1638. Unfortunately, as the Kingdom of Sweden's power in Europe declined, so too did its fortunes in the New World, and after just 16 years, Fort Christina was renamed Fort Casimir when it was conquered by Dutch troops dispatched from New Amsterdam, present-day New York. The Dutch, of course, did not have time to rest on their laurels either, for you see, they found themselves in a series of military conflicts with their great maritime rival, the Kingdom of England. And in the New World, they were hopelessly outmatched. The Dutch philosophy for their colonies was one of commerce and trade, and so they boasted a relatively small population as measured in the year 1670, just 9,000 people. The English, however, had determined to stay and settle en masse, boasting 80,000 people in their colonies in that same year. And so it was with very little difficulty that English forces conquered the Dutch in New Amsterdam and subsequently at Fort Casimir in the year 1674. The territory that came along with it is what we would recognize as Delaware today, which fell under the first jurisdiction of New York Colony, which had been named for the conquering Duke of York. With these European groups and subsequent arrivals to come, as well as Native Americans and people of African descent, both free and enslaved, Delaware became a unique mix of cultures and values from even its earliest days. After the fall of the Dutch New Netherlands, England came in firm and decisive control of what is now Delaware and folded it into what would become known as British North America. Organizationally, they set about establishing their new possessions into a form that we can begin to recognize today. We can trace this early colonial history into two different administrations. The first one was the province of New York. Although most Europeans living within Delaware were Dutch or Swedish by descent, the Anglicization process quickly began as English management systems were installed, and English colonists began migrating in a steady trickle from Maryland, many bringing enslaved people with them. Administratively, representatives from the province of New York divided the region into three rough districts that we can recognize today. The first was Newcastle, which they established in 1664. Newcastle was the primary settlement at the time and had been seized from the Dutch during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Horkill or Deal was the second, established in 1670, encompassing modern-day Lewis and parts inland. This was also where the first court in Delaware was established, giving the first true hint of European law and order being imposed on what was seen as a rough colonial frontier. The last was the district of St. John's, which was established in 1680, which of course we know as Kent County today. It was created 9 years after the first European settlement in the area appeared, as a response to the area's growing population and plantation-based economic viability. After some extraordinary acrimonious debate between the colony of Pennsylvania and the colony of Maryland, Delaware fell under its second administration, William Penn. He took control in 1682, taking over the 3 counties from the Duke of York, for whom, of course, New York is named. His intention was to utilize these 3 counties extending out to the Atlantic Ocean to stop his new city of brotherly love from becoming landlocked. The territory were abundant lands, but they contained relatively few people at the time of his acquisition, barely 400 European inhabitants and approximately 100 enslaved people, aside from the local Lenape and Nanticoke. Nevertheless, in December, he formally renamed the 3 districts into counties along his own personal preference. Newcastle, already properly anglicized in name, remained. St. John's became Kent, and Horkill or Deal became Sussex. Penn dreamed of a tranquil colony united by Quaker ideals, but the Dutch, Swedes, Englishmen, and enslaved Africans of the 3 lower counties just didn't fit that bill. They tended to be local-minded, they competed against the rest of Pennsylvania economically, and they were broadly indignant of their minority status within Pennsylvania's colonial legislature. Critically, they also felt that their needs were not represented by the Quaker pacifists who ran the legislature. After all, in times of war, or even in times of peace, the nearness that Delaware had to the Atlantic increased the threat posed to them by enemy ships, be they from other European powers or pirates raiding up from the Caribbean. After numerous attempts to reconcile these issues, Penn finally acquiesced. He authorized that separate assemblies could now meet in Delaware and Pennsylvania, though his family retained proprietorship and governorship over both. The year was 1704. It is the first year that appears on the modern state seal of Delaware today. As a rule, the British preferred to deal with their North American colonies with a light hand, exerting very little direct control over the day-to-day life of the average British subject. This was especially true in the 3 lower counties of Delaware after 1704. The proprietors, the Penns, and their local legislature, the General Assembly, meant there was essentially two layers of interference between the crown and the people. As a result, the colony began to grow steadily throughout the subsequent decades, and by 1770, the population stood at about 35,000, 20 to 25% of which are estimated to have been enslaved people. In contrast, by the way, the population of Philadelphia, North America's largest English-speaking city, was about 40,000 people itself. When we look at how Delaware's population growth was fueled, we find it was primarily by American-born migrants. Pennsylvanians traveled south to settle in Newcastle County. Marylanders settled primarily in Sussex County, and Kent County, just like in the middle of two poles, received influxes from both. The exception to this rule of American-born migrants was the arrival of a significant number of Scots-Irish, that being Scottish individuals who had settled in Ireland in previous generations, as well as a small but noteworthy number of Welsh. Many of the individuals arriving from Europe did so as indentured servants, most of whom signed an agreement for 3 to 7 years of service in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Ships' masters would then, in turn, sell those contracts upon arrival, especially in seaport towns like Lewis, Newcastle, and Wilmington. It's also worth stating here that despite common conceptualization, very few of these indentured servants were convicts. In fact, the Delaware General Assembly made transportation of convicts to the 3 counties illegal in 1739. It's also worth mentioning the demographics in this period are very difficult to pinpoint with exactness, as the first thorough census for Delaware was not completed until 1790, after the American Revolutionary War was concluded, and Delaware asserted itself as the first state in the federal union. No exploration of colonial Kent County would be complete without the acknowledgement that race-based chattel slavery was integral to colonial life. The first known enslaved man brought to Delmarva shores was named Anthony, taken from the West Indies by a Swedish officer at Fort Christina in 1639. In the decade before the American Revolution, 1/5 to 1/4 of the colony's population were enslaved. It's a figure that's much higher than most of the northern colonies, but lower than any in the South as well. By comparison, we can consider Pennsylvania, whose enslaved population was just about 2.4%. Contrasting Pennsylvania, we can look at our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia, whose enslaved population was 32.5% and 42% respectively. Already in this early part of American history, Delaware was demonstrating its position, striding the divide between North and South. Of particular interest to us is the fact that the largest concentration of slaveholding plantations were in the 10 miles centered on Dover, where enslaved labor drove much of this county's early economic successes. By the time of the Revolution, slavery was woven tightly into the fabric of the colonial Delaware society, especially in its social hierarchy and economy. At its height, some 30% of white households were slaveholding across Delaware. Opposition to slavery, we must also point out, became a growing voice in Kent County as well during the early part of the 18th century. Religious groups, especially the Quakers, led the way. In fact, mainstream Quakers in Delaware were instructed to manumit all enslaved persons they held by the year 1776, or face consequences within their own meeting. Also standing forward to the prominence was a radical sect that sprang up around Dover in 1730 that called themselves the Nicolaites. The Nicolaites went a step further and advocated total racial equality within their congregation. Other abolitionists were perhaps inspired by English common law, which is the foundation for our society today in the United States Constitution. Others by the higher ideals of the American Revolution, asking themselves, if all men were truly created equal, as espoused in the Declaration of Independence, how could they be living up to the dream of what America was ought to be if they held their fellow man in bondage? That Kent County became the third and final county to come into existence in what is now Delaware really shouldn't be surprising, considering that to the north we had a population center in and about New Castle and Wilmington, and to the south a population center at Lewis. In between, individuals on both poles looked towards the middle as untapped but incredibly fertile wilderness. With the expulsion of the Dutch, the last imperial rivals in the area, the land was considered ripe for new settlement, and people began trickling in and then pouring in ever-increasing numbers. The first of these new colonists arrived in the early part of the 1670s, perhaps as early as 1671. Many were driven by commercial desires, hoping to expand the tobacco fields that had made Virginia into Britain's wealthiest North American colony. Others arrived for far more personal reasons. Broadly, these reasons were religious, but religious or not, these personal motivations were ultimately to find a place to escape and settle down on the barely regulated fringes of empire. When looking at the area that now comprises Dover, which even then was the beating heart of Kent County, one has to ask what drew these settlers into this area in the first place. Namely, the answer is the St. John's River, a major tributary of the Delaware Bay, which was once navigable along its first 13 miles using shallow draft vessels. With a lack of major roads in these earliest days, the river became the main thoroughfare, providing communication, transportation, and commerce. Where did these first colonists put down their roots? Broadly on whatever ground that could be found in this relatively flat and marshy region. Dover itself was planted where it is because it stood on relatively high elevation. You can still see a little surviving evidence of this in Dover, standing near the old State House and watching the land fall away towards Legislative Hall, which in turn backs itself up against that St. John's Riverway. Although many of these early arrivals made the first inroads of major European settlement into the area, it's interesting that they did not tend to congregate together. Instead, these first arrivals established farmsteads and even large plantations eked out of the wilderness. By 1742, the population was about 5,000 people. When asked to describe life in colonial Kent County, the prolific writer Thomas Rodney, who is of course brother to the famous revolutionary Caesar Rodney, said it was very simple, plain, and social. For most individuals, small-scale agriculture was the primary pursuit, with the yeoman farmer holding an average of 200 acres by the midpoint of the 18th century. From the 1660s, tobacco had been the primary crop, but due to soil depletion, it had largely been abandoned in favor of corn and wheat. The latter was frequently shipped raw or processed in Philadelphia, and sometimes sent by ship to the West Indies. Most farmers also owned cows, sheep, and hogs, generally for personal consumption. As a measure of comparison, common practices in this time period dictated that 60 acres of land was the subsistence minimum. Additional lands turned profits. That 60 acres was broken down as follows. 20 to 30 acres were assigned to a woodlot, as a typical family burned an acre for fuel every year. 6 acres were then set aside for personal grains, 15 acres for personal livestock, a further 15 acres for hay to feed that livestock, and the remainder for the home lot. 200 acres meant that the average Delaware farmer was relatively affluent for the age. But it's also worth remembering that as these farms were passed down through the generations, they were frequently subdivided, which meant within a generation or two, Delawareans were forced to either be the firstborn to inherit or move west in order to establish landholdings for themselves and their progeny. With holdings totaling in the thousands of acres, the planter elite stood far above the subsistence minimum and even dwarfed the most successful yeoman farmers. The Dover area was extremely popular for these Maryland transplants to establish their own plantations because it offered plentiful land suitable for agriculture, especially in the first third of the 18th century. These families would flourish here, often spawning several other plantations and farmsteads, separating their land out for sharecroppers, and establishing themselves comfortably in townhomes, especially around places like the Dover Green. The root, however, of this wealth was typically large-scale agricultural plantations, sustained by a number of enslaved people. For a prime example of how these plantations operated, we should consider the Drapers of Cedar Creek Hundred in Sussex County, the fourth largest enslavers in the state of Delaware. They held 30 people in bondage, and these people were responsible for clearing, plowing, planting, cultivating, and harvesting corn and wheat, caring for 105 cattle, 76 sheep, 54 pigs, 20 oxen, 8 horses, and 55 geese. They also assisted with mercantile activities and sailed the Draper's shallop back and forth up to Philadelphia. They partook in timbering and trade production, including carpentry and blacksmithing. Enslaved women, meanwhile, completed domestic work within the main plantation house and produced cloth for sale abroad. Overall, the most prominent of these country gentry came to be known as the Philadelphians, keeping country homes in Kent County and townhouses in the main regional metropolis of Philadelphia. As Kent County developed, it became easier to transit across it to other places. In the beginning, there were few good roads in Delaware, but the exception to this rule was the King's Highway, which stretched from Philadelphia to Wilmington and Newcastle, to Odessa, which was then known as Cantwell's Bridge, down to Dover, and finally ending in Lewis. For frame of reference, the average trip to Philadelphia from Dover took 2 days via the King's Highway by a standard carriage. The most reliable form of transit for any large amount of goods went by water, primarily up the St. Jones. Shallops, or small 50 to 30-foot flat-bottomed boats that could be driven by sails or oars, would hold a surprising amount of cargo. The largest and best built were capable of carrying up to 3 tons, or 6,000 pounds. The regular operation of these shallops often meant that Dover had access to European goods from ships on Delaware Bay even before much larger population centers, like Philadelphia, which was often the destination of these large transatlantic vessels. Throughout most of this establishment period, Kent County was overwhelmingly rural. Before the establishment of Dover, there was really no town truly worthy of the name. Beyond the plantations and yeoman farms, there are just a few small economic crossroads, generally settled on a tavern with a couple of craftsmen's shops in attendance. Kingston upon Hull, pictured here, exemplifies this. In fact, Kingston upon Hull is the oldest surviving building in Kent County, dating in its oldest part to 1677. It can still be seen today off the beaten path of the St. John's Preserve in Kithammock, where it endures in increasingly fragile condition, as you can see evidenced on this slide. Now that we have a firm grasp of how Kent County developed, let's take a look finally at our green country town. Let's discover how Dover was established and emerged at the center of the 3 lower counties. When we describe the establishment of the city of Dover to many people on our tours, they're often surprised to hear that a court, of all things, was the nucleus of our city. Today, courthouses generally create negative reactions, so they wonder why they were so important to colonial Americans. To answer this question, we have to really consider what these courts represented. The fact was that courts were the first means by which law and order entered into, at least according to European standards, untamed regions. It's also worth noting that, judging by surviving court records, colonial Americans were also very, very litigious. In essence, Delawareans in the region didn't want to travel all the way up to Newcastle or down to Lewistown or, God forbid, Philadelphia in order to sue the britches off of each other. In the beginning, the establishment of a court didn't necessarily mean a building. They could and often did meet in private homes. But in the end, a permanent structure would be needed eventually if a region was to truly develop. Courthouses, then, were often built in conjunction with a tavern. You're going in to do some legal proceedings, you're going to need a place to stay. These courthouse tavern conglomerates often formed the nucleus of a town. Together they represented stability, and when nearby, convenience. And so it was in the year 1680 that a petition from locals were sent to the representatives of the Duke of York in New York for the creation of a new county on the Delaware, St. John's. With the creation of that county, a court had to come with it, and people began to look around and survey where would be this court's permanent home. Settlements like Lewis and Newcastle grew up directly on the Delaware Bay near the Atlantic coast, allowing them instant access to those main arteries of commerce and communication. Dover, on the other hand, traded that direct access for a few reasons. First, by being upriver, the settlement was better protected from the regular threat of piracy or wartime enemy raiders. Second, the St. John's navigability still ensured fairly reliable access to that main waterway. Third, the town would sit on the most direct land route from Philadelphia and Newcastle down to the burgeoning port at Lewis. This, of course, as we mentioned before, was the King's Highway. It was established in accordance with the wishes of King Charles II, who desired that his American colonists be in closer communication with one another. He ordered that the roads be built between the colonies by, quote, the shortest and most direct routes. Eventually, the King's Road would stretch from Boston, Massachusetts to Charleston, South Carolina. It would, however, not happen overnight. In fact, it would take a total of 65 years to complete between the years of 1673 and 1738. That end date, of course, putting it within just a generation or two of American colonists using it as a major tool to overthrow the British monarchy in America, held by Charles's successor, George III. For 2 years, the people of the St. John's district regularly petitioned the colonial administration in New York for their courthouse. In 1682, the members of that administration were no doubt pleased to turn over the issue to William Penn. For their part, the Kent Countyans simply transferred their complaints to Penn himself. And when he took over, he apparently decided that it wasn't worth the trouble resisting, and agreed with them quickly. Within the year, by 1683, he published a writ ordering the establishment of a courthouse community at the intersection of the King's Highway and St. John's River, just about dead center in the middle of his newly named Kent County. The new Dover, named for the prominent port city on the southern coast of Great Britain, was laid out on paper in accordance to William Penn's personal preferences. He liked his towns to be on a well-ordered grid pattern framed around municipal public spaces. Organizationally, the town was bounded by streets named for the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. The land therein was parceled into various sizes up to 3 acres. The most desirable real estate within these boundaries oriented around 5 major features: the King's Highway, now known as State Street, which bisected the new town. The St. John's River, used for transporting people and goods, was likely accessed from an area south of Legislative Hall today. The public, or later Courthouse Square, was the 1/2 acre that's now known as the Green. Churchman Square, to the south, hosted the Anglican Church, and Meeting House Square to the west hosted the Presbyterian congregation. Although Dover was laid out in this very deliberate and meticulous fashion, it would take time for it to grow organically into its ambitious city plan. The settlement decreed in 1683 would remain a small collection of buildings for over 30 years before the town was officially founded in 1717. It emerged as many colonial villages did, around a courthouse and set of taverns. The first courthouse was built on what would become known as the Dover Green between 1697 and 1699. It would be the town's most important feature until the American Revolution. Ironically, when the town officially came into being in 1717, the courthouse was just 5 years from being moved to where the old State House stands today, where it existed as a small 25-foot square building. Strangely enough, the original site of the Kent County Courthouse would be restored in 1873 in the image seen at left, when the Victorians rebuilt the courthouse. It was modified in the early 20th century to reflect a more colonial style, as seen at right. Taverns were a vital part of colonial life, an absolute necessity in a foot and horse-drawn transit world. They were places where you could get not just a beer, or truly any of the myriad alcoholic beverages so popular in colonial America, but a bed and a bellyful as well, though you might have to share that bed. They also often served as quasi-community centers, featuring a reading room, a meeting space often used as a dance hall, and tended to be drop-off points for mail that transited across the colonies. Dover featured a number of taverns, but the most prominent of these were the Golden Fleece and the Tavern at the Sign of King George, eventually known, after a spat you might have heard of in 1776, as the Tavern at the Sign of George Washington. Interestingly, both of these prominent taverns were operated by women for an impressive length of time. This was not uncommon in this time period, especially as a means to support widows after their husbands had passed without putting them on the public dole. Throughout its history, Dover has played host to more than a dozen such taverns, but some of the earliest known are listed here on the screen. They include, of course, the Golden Fleece, the King George, the Horse and Groom, the Blue Anchor, and the Liberty. Walking down the city's cobbles, these would have been marked by colorful and distinctive tavern signs, like the one from the Golden Fleece reproduced on the image here on the screen. You can see it today on the Dover Green. And with that, we come to Dover's beating heart, the Green. The Dover Green was historically referred to as the Public Square or the Courthouse Square, both terms more accurately reflecting its character and appearance during the 18th century. The proud trees that shade it today were planted a century after the Revolution, during the Victorian era. Throughout the early and late colonial periods, the public square was a center of activity in Dover, where people of all walks of life mingled together. And the green itself represented different things for each and every one of them. It represented justice, with the Kent County Courthouse fronting onto the square. Law and order, too, with the jail placed next to it. Public punishments were even administered within sight of its space. Markets were held on the green as well, where farmers and merchants could assemble on given days to sell their wares. From a business perspective, you couldn't find a better place than this centerpiece of the town and county, from trade works to taverns. Militarily, the Kent County Militia would gather and train on the green, especially during the colonial wars and the American Revolution. These militia gatherings often tended to turn into great social functions as well, as soldiers paraded in snappy uniforms and then frequented the local taverns. The green also, then as now, was a place of celebration, with holidays and festivals celebrated within its boundaries. And lastly, of course, it was a place of wealth. It was the who's who of Kent County as you went around and knocked on each of the doors of all the lodgings surrounding the public square. Some of these prominent families included the Rodneys, who first appeared in the area in 1681, the Lockermans, who arrived in the 1720s, the Dickinsons in 1740, the Ridgeleys between 1748 and 49, the Killenses in 1737, and the Chews in 1738. Most of these families moved to Kent County from the Chesapeake region of Maryland between 1715 and 1750. Most made the move either as non-inheriting sons or in the knowledge that their existing Maryland estates would not provide a good living to the number of their children. Upon arrival, most first founded plantations nearby before acquiring plots in town as their children established themselves, often as merchants, physicians, and lawyers. For many of these families, their fame would be enhanced by their second Delaware generations, who participated in the American Revolution and shepherded Delaware into statehood within the federal Union. This is exemplified, for instance, by the man at top on the right, Samuel Dickinson, whose son John became the penman of the Revolution, and the man at bottom, Vincent Lockerman, who is the second generation to live in Dover, who became the city's most prominent merchant. Today, many of these families' descendants still live in the area. Their dwellings survived a hint of colonial times. Their legacies live on in street names, legal decisions, and political history. And of course, their stories live on as a key component of local Dover lore. Like many old colonial towns, Dover went through tremendous growth in subsequent years, especially the late 19th century. Buildings were torn down and replaced as a natural course of life. However, vestiges of the old village are still there if you know where to look, and a few of them are featured on the following slides. Please do be aware, however, that as you look for these buildings, most of them are still in private hands, and please do respect the privacy of their owners and residents. Standing at the corner of State and Water Street is this unassuming structure, which is actually the oldest building in Dover that we know of, having been built in 1723. It is also believed to be where Caesar Rodney, of future Revolutionary fame, stayed while in town. The other buildings owned by the Rodney family throughout Dover were often used as rentals and thus typically unavailable for his use. Next door to our last stop, and fronting up against the busy King's Highway, is this very early tavern, built in 1724. It is believed, but not yet confirmed, to eventually become the Liberty Tavern, mentioned on the previous slides. Up next, we have the Ridgeley House, which stands on the east side of the Dover Green. The third of the structure closest to the photo's perspective point was built in 1726. It was bought by Charles Greenbury Ridgeley in 1769 and subsequently expanded. It remains with descendants of the Ridgeley family. Added to the tapestry of the city in 1734 is Christ Church. Interestingly, it was not until the 1750s, under the leadership of its most famous Reverend Charles Inglis, that this building actually received glass windows or even a front door, existing for its first 20 years, described by some as something little more than a grand barn. Also standing near the popular intersection of State Street and Water Street is the Lockerman House, built sometime between 1742 and the early 1750s. By far its most prominent resident was Vincent Lockerman, who was Dover's most affluent citizen during the Revolutionary era. Working as a merchant, his house could not have been more appropriately placed. It stood by Water Street, which led down to where the shallops would offload goods to be taken to market on the Dover Green, and his front stoop led out right onto the King's Highway, the main artery for goods and transportation coming down from Philadelphia. And finally, of course, near and dear to us at First State Heritage Park is the John Bell House, built between 1743 and 1772. It was originally part of the King George Tavern complex, operated by the Bell family for several generations. It stands as an extremely rare example of Chesapeake architecture and originally was built as a craftsman's workshop. That makes its survival exceedingly rare. It also happens to be Dover's oldest wooden structure, and now has found new life as our park's interpretation center. I think it appropriate that we leave off our exploration of colonial Dover where that historical epoch ended, 1776. It was along these streets that many of us still walk today, in a smaller town peopled by the families whose plots dominate the landscape of this map, that our forebears collectively launched themselves into the unknown, into the vast but promising future of American independence. If you'd like to learn more on your own, I found these scholarly works especially useful in preparing this program, and would offer them to you as my best suggestions as you continue your own explorations. And lastly, in addition to those resources, I know we covered a considerable amount of ground in this lecture today. If you happen to have any questions that were not covered during the course of this program, please do not hesitate to reach out to me on the contact information included on this page. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.